Deuteronomy 18. I've got up there 15 to 22. That's where we're going to focus. I'm actually going to start reading in verse 14 because there's a contrast. As we talk about the prophets in Israel, there's a contrast that we need to understand. And it comes in verse 14, or at least part of it comes in verse 14. We're beginning a sermon series this week for Advent. Four Sundays leading up to Christmas Eve. It's a sermon series of 4 messages. And we're going to be studying over this time the expectation, the Old Testament expectation. What were they waiting for as Jesus arrives? And I feel like every 2 or 3 years I do the same sermon series, which isn't a bad thing because I'm pretty sure that if I asked you what I preached about in January of this year, most of you would have trouble remembering the 4 or 5 titles that I did in January this year. So repeating things is not unhelpful for us. In fact, if I ever get up here and say something you've never heard before, make sure you check your Bible that it was from there and not just from me, right? Preachers in the Church of Jesus Christ should not be about novelty. We should be about coming back to hear what God has said. He has spoken, and it's Him we need to listen to. And so I don't mind going over the same ground over and over again. It's important for us to hear it. It's important for us to learn it. This year, as I think about the theme of O come Emmanuel, or Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. That's the working title I've got for this series. Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. We're going to look in the 3 sessions that I have with you. We're going to have a guest speaker actually on December the 11th. We're going to have a guest speaker, Dan Gabor from Bethany in the Sioux is going to come speak, and he's going to talk about the dedication of Jesus. And so what we have is in Luke chapter 2 there, we have 2 Old Testament saints who have been waiting for the arrival of this Messiah, and they finally see the one that's been promised, and they respond to that. Bethany actually has a baby dedication, a child dedication that's coming up during this Advent season. And I said, you know what, Dan, that would be a perfect message for us as we're thinking about the expectation of Jesus' arrival. That's a perfect message for us as part of this series. So we're going to look, Dan's going to take us to that. But in my 3 times with you, I want to talk about Jesus coming to fulfill 3 offices in the Old Testament. Does anybody know the 3 offices that Jesus fills from the Old Testament? Peter. Prophet, priest, and king. There are 3 Old Testament offices that as we see Jesus coming as our Messiah, He is the great prophet, He is our high priest, and He is the king who sits on the throne of David forever. Our prophet, our priest, our king. Understanding who Jesus is, we need to get these ideas from the Old Testament so that when He arrives, we know Him. We recognize Him. How do you know what God has said? How do you know it's really true? That is an important question. If we want to find what is true, what is real, what is meaningful, where do we go? It's an important question. As we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 18, there is a promise given by God. A promise given in Deuteronomy. So for many of you, you'll know that Deuteronomy is sort of a series of messages that Moses gives to the people right on the border of the Promised Land. It summarizes much of what He has already given to them in the law, much of what they've already seen throughout their wandering in the wilderness. Moses reminds them of these things that really matter, and it's his sort of farewell addresses to the people. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, there is a promise given. Let me read for you verses 14 to 22. Hear the word of the Lord. The nations you will dispossess. Listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked of the Lord, the God, your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not go hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die. The Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words, that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything that I have not commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, must be put to death. You may say to yourselves, how can we know when the message has not been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message the Lord has not spoken. That prophet has spoken presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. This is the word of the Lord, and we thank God for his word. Did you hear the promise? God said, as you are wondering what it is I have for you, as you are longing to hear my word, I will raise up individuals who will speak to you, and they will speak my word. So I want to use this passage to help us understand what is it that a prophet does. Who is a prophet? And so the first point in your little sermon notes, the question is, who is a prophet and what does he or she do? We do have examples of prophetesses in the Old Testament as well. So what is this prophetic office? And I think Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 22 is a great place for us to go because God explicitly says, this is what I am going to do. This is what a prophet is. This is how you will know a true prophet from a false prophet. So as we look here, I want to point out a few key elements. What struck you as you were reading this passage? Was there anything there that stood out to you, that jumped out to you? There's a couple things that are absolutely important we see. So the calling is important. And that's the first point I want to point out. It is not the initiative of the individual to reach out and take hold of that prophetic office. That's not the picture in the Old Testament. You don't aspire to being a prophet. Now, I don't think it would be a terrible thing for any ancient Israelite to say, I really want to serve the Lord and to study under the prophet. In fact, we find that in Old Testament Israel, there was almost like this college of prophets, this group who would discern the Lord's will together. They come up from time to time in the Old Testament. But the key to the prophetic calling is not the aspiration of human beings. What does God say? He says, I will raise up for them a prophet. And in fact, the warning is, do not presume to speak for the Lord. What's the punishment? What's the penalty in this passage for presuming to speak for the Lord? Death, right? So if one of your brothers, Israelites, stands up and says, thus saith the Lord, but it wasn't for me, that is a major offense. Within Israel, speaking for the Lord when he has not put you in that place, when he has not given you the word to speak, when you presume to speak for the Lord, it is a serious thing. By the way, as the one who gets up here and opens the Bible every week and says, thus saith the Lord, your pastor better feel the weight of that every week as well, right? We will be held to account. In fact, in James it talks about those who teach and the seriousness with which they ought to take that responsibility. It's not just an old... Now, please don't, the next time I have a bad sermon, take me outside and stone me to death. But it should, at the very least, impress upon us the seriousness of speaking the Lord's words after him. By the way, you too have been called to preach the good news in the world around us. Let us make sure we take that responsibility seriously. Christians, there are so many of us who have connected the truth of Jesus because we are identified by the world as Christians with things that are so far from Christ because of the things we have said and done foolishly. I regret so many things that I have spoken, and I don't go out saying, oh, look what God says. But I carry the name of Christ with me. And look what I said. Look what I did. First thing we need to recognize about the prophet is that he is raised up by God. He does not speak presumptuously. that he is given the power of the Spirit of God to speak among his brothers and sisters as God commands them. And notice, he will tell them everything I command him. That's another thing I find really challenging as a preacher. Are you ready to say everything God has said? Are you ready to preach every aspect of the good news of Jesus Christ, even when it calls people to die to themselves? Even when it calls them away from the things they treasure and cherish? Remember the story of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus? Jesus says to him, well, what does the law say? You know, obey the law, and that's what God has told us, right? As Israelites, we were called to live as covenant people, and that's what the law calls us to be and do. And the young man says, you know what? Since I was a little kid, I did it. What I find, one of the truly remarkable things about that story to me is that it talks, in some of the Gospels, it talks about Jesus' genuine love for that young man, right? But his next words were, well, I've got one more thing to add to it for you. One more thing. I know you're a wealthy guy. You need to get rid of your wealth. Give it to those who are in need, and then come follow me. And it broke his heart. As a preacher of the good news of Jesus Christ, are you and I ready to proclaim everything the Lord has commanded? That's a real challenge. Anything else we notice about the prophet in the Old Testament? Well, let me give you a hint. There's a reason I read for you verse 14. There is a statement that says the world, these people around you, the people you get rid of, they practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. We humans are so prone to wanting to manipulate and be in control. Sorcery and divination moved away from the God of the universe and turned instead to spirits and magic and those things which we manipulate as human beings to twist and work. And God says, you will have none of that. None of the idolatry, none of the spirituality of the peoples around you. I am the Lord your God. I rescued you out of Egypt. I called you to myself, and I made a covenant with you. The one place you hear from me is the prophets who I will raise up. I will speak, and I, the Lord, choose the means by which I communicate myself to you. You don't come to me on your own terms. You don't hear from me on your own terms. I will bring to you my word, my way, with clarity, with force. There are many ways that we hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are diverse ways that God communicates his truth with us. We talk to people all the time who, as they walk through the forest, the hymns of the faith or the psalms in Scripture, passages of Scripture, they come to mind as we walk through the trees or under starlit skies. Like there are times genuinely while I am out in nature and I think to myself, the heavens declare the glory of God. But it's another thing if I go out to the barnyard and I kill a chicken and I open its innards and I try and figure out what my lottery numbers ought to be based on what I find in the innards of a chicken. I pray that that's not, I was trying to be facetious with that example. But there are superstitions, there are humanly originated practices, there are things that we try and manipulate. We don't come to God to hear his word. We want to try and define the future for ourselves. We want to define reality for ourselves. Let me tell you, if there is a gospel you want to hear preached today, but it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ, you will find some prophet, some spiritualist, some sorcerer, some diviner who will preach the gospel you want to hear today. You will. The Lord himself will raise up a prophet. Let us not depart from the Lord when he speaks. And we see throughout the Old Testament how God raises up these prophets. He answers this prayer. He answers the prayer, or he answers the promise rather, that he made here. So let me take you, it's not on the up there, but I want to summarize for you an example of the prophet of God doing what God promised. And that's in 1 Kings chapter 18. And then I'm also going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to add a little bit of 1 Kings 19. Because I need to demonstrate that we're not quite there yet when we see Elijah the prophet in verse 18. Typically in the New Testament, when we see the law and the prophets represented by individuals, who are the two individuals we see? Who in the New Testament for us represents the law? I'll give you a clue. We just heard from him. Moses, right? Who represents the prophets when we see them represented by a person in the New Testament? Elijah, right? So remember the Mount of Transfiguration, the story from the New Testament? Jesus climbs up the mountain with a few of his closest disciples, and he is transfigured. He's seen in shining glory. And with him are two individuals. There is Moses, who represents the law, and Elijah, who represents the prophets. And Elijah is this archetype of the prophet of Israel in the Old Testament. One who speaks for the Lord to a people, by the way, who don't want to hear his message. And so in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah proposes this contest to the false prophets who we find in Israel. False prophets who preach the message of another God. And so they climb up to this mountain and they say, okay, here's how we're going to do this. We're each going to set up a sacrifice to our God, and the true God is the one who answers with fire from heaven. The real God is the one who answers the prayers of his priests and prophets, the one who responds with power as he is called out to. This is a contest, a battle between the gods, and finally, today, we'll know who the real God is in Israel. And so they go up, and the prophets of Baal, they set up their altar and their sacrifice, and they begin performing their rituals. And it says in verse 26, so they took the bull given to them and they prepared it. They called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. So notice this is not again, next time you're tempted to complain about the length of the preacher on Sunday morning, at least he didn't go on from, well, maybe sometimes he does go on from morning till noon, but this is the prophets of Baal. They are crying out to God from morning till noon, O Baal, answer us. But there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. Now, I want you to think back now to Deuteronomy chapter 18. What did we just read? What was the sign that the false prophet was among you? That the things he said would not come true. Isn't that what Moses told us in Deuteronomy 18? You see, Elijah, acting on behalf of God as his emissary, is well aware of the promise. He knows the law. God himself gave the law, so his prophet ought to know it. He better know it. No one answered, and they danced around the altar that they had made. And I think, by the way, for those of you who think the Bible is always serious, let me read these next verses to you, okay? At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is in deep thought. Perhaps he's busy. Or maybe he's traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awoken. Now, do you hear how insulting that is to the prophets of Baal? No, I'm sure your God is real. You're just not loud enough. He's asleep. You need to wake him up. The response of the prophets of Baal? So they shouted louder, and they slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, till their blood flowed. The prophets, their gods do not answer.